There is a place in the Badlands of eastern Montana where the rock is the color of old rust, and the wind never really stops. And if you know what to look for, you can walk across ground that was once the floor of a world so different from this one that it barely seems real. The hills here have been carved by rain and freeze and time into strange broken shapes, ridges like the spines of buried giants, gullies that open without warning, slopes of crumbling mudstone that shift and slide with every season. Nothing grows well. The sky is enormous, and in the walls of these eroding slopes, bones are always surfacing. Not metaphorically, literally. Bones the size of your arm, bones the color of dark chocolate, bones that spent 66 million years compressed inside stone, and are now, because of a wet spring and a dry summer, and the slow, patient work of erosion, emerging back into the light. This is the Hell Creek Formation, and what was found here, not once but again and again across more than a century of digging, did not merely add to what science knew about the age of dinosaurs. It dismantled assumptions. It raised questions that scientists had not thought to ask. It produced specimens so extraordinary, so complete, so strange in their implications, that entire frameworks built over generations had to be quietly abandoned and rebuilt from scratch. The Hell Creek Formation is not simply a famous fossil site. It is the place where our understanding of the end of the dinosaur world, of how they lived, of how they died, and of what the last chapter of their reign actually looked like, was written and rewritten and written again. It is the graveyard that changed everything we thought we knew. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. I am always curious to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you have not already. Take a deep breath, and let the modern world fade away. To understand what the Hell Creek Formation is, and why it matters so deeply, you first need to understand what it replaced in the scientific imagination. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, paleontology operated under a set of assumptions about dinosaurs that felt, to the scientists who held them, essentially settled. Dinosaurs were large, they were slow, they were reptiles in the old, unflattering sense of the word, cold and dim and fundamentally incapable of the kind of complexity we associate with birds or mammals. They had ruled the Mesozoic era for roughly 165 million years, longer than any group of large land animals before or since. And then, 66 million years ago, they had simply vanished. The story seemed complete. The giants had their moment, the world ended, the mammals inherited the earth, and that was that. What the Hell Creek Formation revealed, slowly and then all at once, was that this story was wrong in almost every particular. The dinosaurs that died at Hell Creek were not the slow, swamp-bound, dim creatures of the old textbooks. They were warm-blooded in many senses that mattered. They were socially complex. They were ecologically sophisticated. Some of them had feathers. Some of them cared for their young. The extinction that ended them was not a gradual fading, but a sudden, catastrophic, almost instantaneous geological event that killed approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth within what amounts, in geological terms, to a single afternoon. And the animals that survived, the ones that eventually gave rise to every bird alive today, did so not because they were better adapted in any general sense, but because of accidents of size and diet and habitat that had nothing to do with superiority and everything to do with luck. None of this was obvious in the beginning. In the beginning, there was just the rock, and the bones inside it, and the men and women who were willing to spend their lives on their knees in the heat and the dust, chipping away at mudstone with hammers and brushes, trying to understand what the earth had preserved for them. The Hell Creek Formation takes its name from Hell Creek itself, a small seasonal drainage in Carter County, Montana, named not for any infernal quality but simply because it was difficult terrain that frustrated early ranchers trying to move cattle across it. The formation is not a single site but a geological unit, a specific layer of ancient rock that was deposited between approximately 68 and 66 million years ago, during the very end of the Cretaceous period. It extends across parts of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, covering an area of several 100,000 square kilometers. Wherever it is exposed at the surface, wherever erosion has stripped away the younger rock above it, it offers a window into one of the most consequential 2 million years in the history of life on Earth. The rock itself tells you something before you even find a fossil. The Hell Creek Formation is made primarily of mudstone, sandstone, and clay deposited by rivers and floodplains in a warm, humid lowland environment. 66 million years ago, this region looked nothing like the harsh badlands it is today. It was a subtropical coastal plain, lush and warm, lying at roughly the latitude of present-day Florida. A shallow inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway still divided North America into two separate landmasses, its shoreline not far to the east. To the west, the Rocky Mountains were still young and actively rising, shedding sediment eastward into broad river deltas and floodplains. The climate was warmer than today, with no permanent polar ice, and the vegetation was dense, a mix of flowering plants, ferns, conifers, and early broadleaf trees that provided food for some of the largest herbivores the land had ever seen. Into this landscape, imagine walking. The air is thick and warm. The smell is green and wet. The smell of standing water and flowering plants, and the faint animal musk of something enormous moving through the undergrowth not far away. The ground is soft in places, particularly near the river channels, and the mud at the river's edge is deeply scored with the tracks of animals so large that their footprints are the size of a bathtub. This is the Hell Creek world. This is the world whose bones are still coming out of the ground in eastern Montana, preserved in those ancient muds that hardened to stone over 66 million years. The first serious scientific attention to this region came in the late 19th century, during the extraordinary and somewhat chaotic period of American paleontology, now known as the Bone Wars. In the 1870s and 80s, two rival paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh of Yale and Edward Drinker Cope, a fiercely independent researcher based in Philadelphia, engaged in one of the most bitter and productive scientific feuds in history. Both men funded expeditions to the American West. Both employed teams of collectors who combed the Badlands for fossil bones, and both described new species at a ferocious pace, sometimes announcing discoveries before they were fully prepared, sometimes making catastrophic errors in their haste to outpace the other. Marsh famously mounted the skull of Apatosaurus on the wrong end of the skeleton. Cope made errors nearly as spectacular. But between them, driven by vanity and genuine scientific passion in equal measure, they described more new dinosaur species than any scientist before or since. It was during this era that the first significant Hell Creek specimens began to emerge. John Bell Hatcher, one of the most gifted fossil collectors of the 19th century, worked for Marsh and collected extensively in the Cretaceous Badlands of the northern Great Plains. Hatcher had an almost supernatural ability to find fossils that others had missed, and he brought back from the Hell Creek region specimens of Triceratops and other late Cretaceous animals that immediately attracted scientific interest. The rock he was working in was unusual. It lay just below the boundary where the dinosaurs ended. It was, though no one fully understood this at the time, the last chapter. The name Tyrannosaurus rex entered the world in 1905, when Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History described a large fragmentary specimen collected from the Hell Creek Formation in Montana by Barnum Brown, the museum's most celebrated fossil hunter. Brown had found the animal in 1902, a partial skeleton preserved in hard sandstone in the Badlands of the Judith River drainage. He went back in 1905 and found a second, more complete specimen. Osborn described both and gave the genus its enduring name, Tyrannosaurus, meaning tyrant lizard, and the species epithet Rex, meaning king. The name was theatrical, and it was also accurate. This was the apex predator of the Hell Creek world, the largest land carnivore that had ever lived in North America, and the most famous animal ever pulled from the ground. But the story of what Tyrannosaurus Rex actually was, how it moved, how it grew, how it hunted, how it lived and died, was far from settled in 1905. In many ways, it had barely begun. The Hell Creek Formation accumulated its extraordinary fossil record because of the particular nature of its depositional environment. Rivers carry sediment and deposit it in predictable ways. Fast-moving water carries larger particles. Slow-moving water or standing water drops fine particles, the muds and silts that are most favorable for preservation. When an animal died in or near a Hell Creek river 66 million years ago, its body might be quickly buried by a flood, covered by sediment before scavengers could fully disarticulate it, and then preserved in the fine-grained matrix of the floodplain. The bones, gradually replaced by minerals from the surrounding groundwater in a process called permineralization, would slowly become stone themselves, retaining their shape while losing their organic material. This process, called taphonomy from the Greek for burial lore, is the science of how organisms become fossils, and the Hell Creek Formation represents one of the most favorable taphonomic environments ever preserved in the geological record. Not everything was preserved equally. Soft tissues almost never survived. Skin impressions occasionally did, where the hide of an animal dried and hardened before it could decompose, leaving a mold in the surrounding mud. Eggs and nests survived under certain conditions. Gastroliths, the smooth, rounded stones that some dinosaurs swallowed to aid digestion, survived because they were stone to begin with. But the bones are the primary record, and they are extraordinary in their variety and their abundance. Hell Creek has yielded specimens of Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Thescelosaurus, and dozens of other species, along with crocodilians, turtles, lizards, early mammals, fish, and the birds that were themselves a lineage of dinosaurs. It is that last category that deserves particular attention because it sits at the heart of one of the most profound revisions in the history of paleontology. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus held that dinosaurs and birds were related but distinct. Birds had evolved from some reptilian ancestor, possibly a dinosaur-like creature, but the details were murky and contested. The dominant view, shaped heavily by the work of Richard Swan Lull and others in the early 20th century, was that dinosaurs were essentially reptiles, fundamentally different from birds in their metabolism, their behavior, and their fundamental biology. Then, beginning in the 1960s and accelerating dramatically through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a revolution happened. John Ostrom, a paleontologist at Yale University, was working with a strange, small dinosaur from the Cretaceous of Montana called Deinonychus antiropus. This animal, whose name means terrible claw, was a predator about the size of a large turkey but with a sickle-shaped claw on each hind foot that it apparently used to slash at prey. Ostrom published his description of Deinonychus in 1969, and the paper was quietly transformative. Deinonychus was not what a dinosaur was supposed to be. It was lightly built, clearly agile, anatomically complex in ways that suggested an active, warm-blooded lifestyle rather than a sluggish, reptilian one. And its skeletal anatomy was remarkably, almost uncannily, bird-like. Ostrom followed his Deinonychus work with a detailed anatomical comparison between dinosaurs and Archaeopteryx, the famous early bird from the Jurassic of Germany, and his conclusion was startling in its clarity. Birds were not merely related to dinosaurs. Birds were dinosaurs, Specifically, they were theropod dinosaurs, the same great lineage that had produced Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor and Allosaurus and hundreds of other two-legged predators across the Mesozoic. The wishbone that you snap at Thanksgiving dinner, the hollow bones that make a chicken so light, the scales on a bird's feet. These were not convergent features that birds had evolved independently. They were inherited features, passed down from theropod dinosaur ancestors, preserved because they worked. This idea, known as the dinosaur origin of birds hypothesis, is now the universal scientific consensus. It is not a fringe theory or a controversial claim. It is as well established as any conclusion in vertebrate paleontology. Birds are avian dinosaurs. The chickens and sparrows and eagles alive today are not descendants of the dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs, surviving members of a lineage that goes back to the Triassic period, 250 million years ago, when the Great Extinction 66 million years ago destroyed the non-avian dinosaurs. Those last surviving avian lineages carried the dinosaurian experiment forward into the present day. And this changes everything about how you look at a Hell Creek fossil. When you look at a Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton, you are looking at the closest relative of the bird outside the birds themselves. You are looking at an animal whose anatomy was more similar to a chicken than either of them is to a crocodile. You are looking at something that almost certainly had a complex physiology, a fast metabolism, possibly warm blood in the same sense that a bird is warm-blooded. You are looking at an animal that was, in the deepest biological sense, more alive than the old textbooks ever allowed. The question then becomes, how do we know? The bones of a Tyrannosaurus rex are not labeled. They do not come with explanatory notes. They are simply shapes, enormous shapes, preserved in stone. The science of reading them, of extracting biological information from mineralized bone, has become one of the most sophisticated and productive enterprises in the history of natural science. One of the most powerful tools in modern paleontology is bone histology, the study of the microscopic internal structure of fossilized bone. Bone, even bone that has been mineralized for tens of millions of years, retains a remarkable amount of structural information about the animal that grew it. If you take a thin slice of a dinosaur bone and put it under a microscope, you can read it the way you read a tree ring. You can see the growth lines, called lines of arrested growth, or LAGs, that form during seasons when growth slowed or stopped. You can see the density and arrangement of the channels that once carried blood vessels, which tells you something about the metabolic rate of the animal. You can see the structure of the bone tissue itself, whether it is the rapidly deposited, fibrous bone associated with fast growth and high metabolism, or the denser, more slowly laid down bone associated with ectothermic, cold-blooded animals. What bone histology has revealed about Hell Creek dinosaurs is extraordinary. Tyrannosaurus rex, it turns out, grew faster than almost anyone expected. Studies by Gregory Erickson of Florida State University, published in the early 2000s, showed that Tyrannosaurus went through a period of explosive juvenile growth, adding as much as 2 kilograms per day during its teenage years, before growth slowed dramatically as it reached adult size. The bone tissue from this growth phase is fibrolamellar bone, the same type found in modern birds and mammals, not the slow-growing bone of reptiles. This is not proof of warm-bloodedness in the full avian or mammalian sense, but it is strong evidence of a physiology quite different from anything in the living reptile world. Jack Horner, the paleontologist who spent decades working out of the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, Montana, has been one of the central figures in the Hell Creek story for more than 40 years. Horner is a complicated, brilliant, sometimes deliberately provocative scientist who has made a career of forcing paleontology to question its most comfortable assumptions. He was, for a long stretch of the 1980s and 90s, the most famous paleontologist in the world after Jurassic Park, in which he served as the technical advisor and the inspiration for the character of Alan Grant, transformed him into a public figure. But his real contribution to science was not Hollywood. It was a series of discoveries in the Badlands of Montana that fundamentally changed the understanding of dinosaur behavior. In the late 1970s, Horner and his colleague Robert McKeeler were working in the Two Medicine Formation in Montana, a geological unit somewhat older than the Hell Creek Formation, but from the same general era of the Late Cretaceous, when they were led by a rock shop owner named Marion Brandvold to a hillside where she had found some unusual small bones. What Horner and Makela found there was a nest. Not a single nest, but a nesting colony. An entire site where a hadrosaur, a large duck-billed dinosaur, had laid eggs, tended its young, and apparently returned season after season to the same place. The animal was new to science, and Horner named it Maiasaura peeblesaurum, the good mother lizard from the Peebles area. Maiasaura was not from the Hell Creek Formation, but it was from the same general Late Cretaceous world of Montana, and what it revealed sent shockwaves through paleontology. The nests showed evidence of parental care. The hatchlings found inside the nests had poorly developed joints, suggesting they could not walk well and depended on adults for food. The presence of plant material inside the nest suggested that parents had been bringing food to the young. These were not reptilian behaviors. These were behaviors that belonged to a category of animal care, of nest tending and chick rearing that we associate with birds. Maiasaura cared for its young. It sat on or near its nests. It was a social animal that gathered in large colonies to breed, and it lived in the same time and the same world as the animals of the Hell Creek Formation. The implications for how we thought about the Hell Creek ecosystem were considerable. If large hadrosaurs were nesting in colonies and raising young, if the social lives of late Cretaceous dinosaurs were this complex, then the Hell Creek world was not a collection of slow-moving, solitary giants plodding through swamps. It was a functioning ecosystem of extraordinary sophistication, with social structures, parental behaviors, migration patterns, and ecological relationships that rivaled anything in the modern animal world. Horner went on to make another discovery that was, if anything, even more disruptive. Working in the Two Medicine Formation through the 1990s and into the 2000s, he and his colleagues accumulated an enormous sample of a dinosaur called Troodon, and later, more controversially, a series of specimens he initially described as multiple different species, that he eventually argued were all growth stages of the same animal. This argument, known as the ontogenetic hypothesis, proposed that many of the dinosaurs described as distinct species were actually juveniles of already known species. The most contentious version of this argument involved the Hell Creek Formation directly. When Horner proposed that Torosaurus, a large ceratopsian with enormous paired holes in its frill, was simply the adult form of Triceratops, and that the two had never been separate species at all. The frill, Horner argued, was still growing and solidifying in Triceratops, and only the fully adult animals had developed the open fenestrae of the Torosaurus form. This claim remains actively contested. Other researchers, including Nicholas Longrich of the University of Bath and Daniel Field, have argued that the available evidence does not support Horner's ontogenetic interpretation, and that Torosaurus and Triceratops are genuinely distinct animals. The debate is unresolved, and that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates something important about how paleontology actually works. It is not a discipline of settled answers. It is a discipline of accumulating evidence and competing interpretations, of specimens that sometimes appear to resolve a question and sometimes raise three new ones. The Hell Creek Formation has been producing specimens for more than 100 years, and it is still producing discoveries that overturn what we thought we knew. Triceratops itself is a good example of how our understanding of a single animal can be completely rebuilt by new evidence. When Othniel Charles Marsh described the first Triceratops specimen in 1889, he initially thought the horned skull fragment belonged to a large extinct bison. When additional material made clear that it was a dinosaur, the picture that emerged was of a large, slow, heavily armored animal whose 3 horns and massive bony frill served primarily as defensive weapons against Tyrannosaurus. That story was simple and satisfying. It lasted most of a century. Then, beginning in the 1990s, researchers started looking more carefully at the frill and horns in large samples of Triceratops specimens, and they noticed something. The horns changed shape significantly across the growth series. Young Triceratops had short, backward curving horns. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Adult Triceratops had long, forward-projecting horns. The frill itself showed enormous variation in colour and texture that, in life, would almost certainly have been visually significant. The most recent analyses of Triceratops frill microstructure, conducted by Andrew Fark and others, suggest that the frill was richly supplied with blood vessels, which in a living animal would have allowed it to flush with colour, to display. The horns and frill of Triceratops, it now appears, were not primarily defensive. They were primarily display structures, used in recognition of individuals, in mate choice, and possibly in intra-specific combat, the same way the antlers of a modern elk are used. This reinterpretation matters because it changes the fundamental picture of the Hell Creek ecosystem. An animal with elaborate display structures is an animal with a rich social life. An animal that invests that much bone and that much energy into growing a 3-meter wide bony frill is an animal for whom social signaling was critically important. Triceratops was not a solitary tank. It was a social animal, probably living in herds, recognizing individuals, competing for mates. Its world structured by relationships and hierarchies that we can barely glimpse through the fossil record. The same reinterpretation has been applied to the frill of other ceratopsians. Pacarinosaurus, Styracosaurus, Centrosaurus, all of the great horned dinosaurs of the Late Cretaceous show the same pattern of elaborate frill ornamentation that almost certainly served display functions. And Triceratops, the last and most abundant of the ceratopsians, the animal whose fossils are so numerous in the Hell Creek Formation that they represent roughly 40% of the large vertebrate specimens from that rock, was almost certainly the most socially sophisticated of them all. There is a particular specimen of Triceratops that deserves its own meditation. In 2014, a nearly complete Triceratops skeleton was recovered from the Hell Creek Formation in North Dakota by commercial fossil preparator Mark Eatman. The specimen, given the informal name of Lane after the county where it was found, is one of the most complete ceratopsian skeletons ever discovered, preserving not only most of the skull and postcranial skeleton, but also areas of preserved skin impressions along the frill and neck region. When the preparators cleaning the specimen examined the skin impressions under magnification, they found something remarkable. The skin texture on the frill was not uniform. Different regions of the frill had different scale patterns, suggesting that different parts of the frill may have had different colours or textures in life. The animal was not a monochrome grey slab. It was almost certainly patterned, possibly dramatically so. We cannot know what colours Triceratops displayed. We cannot recover the pigments, but the texture evidence, combined with what we know about the display functions of the frill, suggests strongly that the visual appearance of a living Triceratops was far more complex and vivid than any museum reconstruction has ever shown. The creature in the ground is always stranger than the creature on the museum floor. Edmontosaurus is the third of the great Hell Creek triumvirate, the enormous duck-billed hadrosaur that fed in vast herds on the lowland vegetation of the late Cretaceous coastal plain. Edmontosaurus has traditionally been reconstructed as something like a prehistoric cow. Enormous, placid, cropping vegetation with its battery of interlocking teeth, fleeing in vast herds from the Tyrannosaurus that preyed on it. That picture is not wrong, exactly. but it is incomplete in ways that new discoveries have begun to fill in. In 2013, a specimen of Edmontosaurus annectens from the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota was described by Bell and colleagues that preserved a remarkable, soft tissue structure on the top of the skull. The specimen, nicknamed Dakota, originally though now typically referred to by its specimen number, showed that Edmontosaurus had a fleshy crest on the back of its head, something like a rooster's comb, made not of bone, but of soft tissue. Nothing in the bony anatomy of the skull had predicted this structure. It had been invisible in the fossil record for 100 years. It was only preserved because this particular individual died in conditions that allowed the soft tissues of the crest to dry and mummify before burial, creating an impression in the surrounding rock. The crest, like the Triceratops frill, was almost certainly a display structure, and its discovery in a hadrosaur, an animal group not previously known to have prominent visual displays, suggested that the visual complexity of the Hell Creek ecosystem had been systematically underestimated. The animals we had been reconstructing as plain-looking were not plain. They were vivid. They were signaling constantly, communicating social information through body color and shape and movement in ways that left almost no trace in the bones. This is one of the most humbling lessons of the Hell Creek Formation. Bone survives, soft tissue almost never does. The fossils we have represent the skeleton of the animal's reality. The flesh, the color, the behavior, the sound, the smell, the social dynamic, all of that is invisible in the rock. We are like archaeologists who have recovered only the stone foundations of a city, and are trying to reconstruct what the buildings look like, what the streets sounded like, what language the inhabitants spoke. The foundations are real. The city was real. But the gap between what survives and what lived is immense. And every new discovery that bridges that gap even slightly is worth marveling at. Tyrannosaurus rex has, of course, received the most attention of all the Hell Creek animals. It is the most famous dinosaur. It is the most studied. It has been the subject of more papers, more debates, more complete revisions of understanding than any other prehistoric animal in history. And the picture that has emerged over the last 30 years is so different from the animal of the early 20th century textbooks that they almost seem like different creatures. The old Tyrannosaurus stood upright, tail dragging, moving at a slow reptilian trudge, its forelimbs vestigial afterthoughts, its brain small, its senses dim. Every one of these ideas has been overturned, and the overturning of each one came from the Hell Creek Formation and the specimens it produced. The posture issue was resolved by the work of biomechanists in the 1970s and 80s, who demonstrated, through careful analysis of joint structure and muscle attachment, that Tyrannosaurus could not have stood upright the way the old mounts showed. The skeleton, properly understood, required a horizontal posture, body roughly parallel to the ground, tail held out behind as a counterbalance for the enormous head. This is how all large theropod dinosaurs actually stood. The upright posture of the early reconstructions was an artifact of how the first specimens were mounted, not an accurate reading of the anatomy. The correct posture makes Tyrannosaurus look simultaneously more like a bird and more terrifying. A massive horizontal body on powerful hind legs, the head forward and low, the eyes scanning. The brain of Tyrannosaurus, examined through CT scanning of intact skulls, turned out to be nothing like the small, primitive reptilian brain the early reconstructions assumed. The olfactory bulbs, the regions of the brain dedicated to smell, were enormous, suggesting that Tyrannosaurus had an exceptionally powerful sense of smell, comparable in relative terms to that of a modern turkey vulture or an albatross. The optic lobes were also large. The eyes of Tyrannosaurus rex, housed in deep, forward-facing orbits, were probably larger than your entire head, and the forward-facing arrangement meant that Tyrannosaurus had substantial binocular vision. the kind of overlapping visual field that allows precise depth perception. Kent Stevens of the University of Oregon has calculated that Tyrannosaurus had a binocular field of view of about 55 degrees, wider than a human's, and could resolve detail at distances up to 6 times greater than a modern hawk. You could not hide from a Tyrannosaurus rex. It would see you clearly before you knew it was there. The hearing of Tyrannosaurus is harder to assess, but the structure of the inner ear, studied by Kieran Buller and colleagues, suggests that Tyrannosaurus was sensitive to low-frequency sounds, particularly in the range below 1000 Hz. This is interesting because many large animals, including elephants, communicate over long distances using low-frequency calls that travel farther through dense vegetation than higher-pitched sounds. The inner ear of Tyrannosaurus was tuned to exactly the frequency range that a large animal in a forested floodplain environment would find most useful. It could almost certainly hear the low rumbling of a Triceratops herd moving through the undergrowth at considerable distance. It could hear things you could not. The speed of Tyrannosaurus has been one of the most contested questions in paleontology. The popular image of the animal as it appears in Jurassic Park, moving at roughly the speed of a running jeep and easily keeping pace with a sprinting human, is almost certainly wrong, though the reasons are more interesting than simple dismissal. The core issue is biomechanical. Tyrannosaurus was enormously heavy, with adult specimens estimated at between 7 and 9 metric tons based on volumetric and skeletal mass calculations. At that body mass, the muscle required to support high-speed running would have needed to constitute an impossibly large proportion of the total body weight. John Hutchinson of the Royal Veterinary College in London has done the most rigorous analysis of Tyrannosaurus locomotion, and his conclusion is that adults probably had a maximum speed of somewhere between 17 and 29 kilometers per hour, roughly the speed of a moderately fit human runner. Not slow by any means, not a sprinter either. But the more interesting finding from Hutchinson's work is that younger, smaller Tyrannosaurus were significantly faster. An adolescent Tyrannosaurus, perhaps a third of adult weight, would have had proportionally larger leg muscles and much better running capacity. This ties into the growth rate data mentioned earlier. The explosive juvenile growth phase, the period when a Tyrannosaurus was adding 2 kilograms of body weight per day, produced an animal that went through a very different ecological role from the adult. Juvenile Tyrannosaurus were probably active pursuit predators, faster and more agile than the adults. The adults, enormous and heavy, may have been more ambush predators or more scavengers than is comfortable for the popular image, or some combination of both. The ecology of Tyrannosaurus rex was not one thing. It was a variable strategy that changed across a lifetime spanning approximately 20 to 28 years, based on growth rate analysis. The feather question is perhaps the most emotionally charged in all of Tyrannosaurus research, because it cuts most directly at the popular image of the animal. Tyrannosaurus is almost universally depicted as scaly. Every museum mount, every film reconstruction, every model shows a scaly-skinned animal, and for a long time, there was no strong evidence either way. Feathers do not fossilize well. The evidence for feathers in non-avian dinosaurs comes almost entirely from exceptional preservation sites in China, particularly the Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province, where fine-grained volcanic ash deposits preserve the entire bodies of small feathered dinosaurs in extraordinary detail. From these sites, beginning in the mid-1990s, a cascade of discoveries fundamentally proved that feathers were not unique to birds, but were present across a broad range of theropod dinosaurs. The question was whether feathers extended to the very largest theropods, to Tyrannosaurus and its relatives. The Tyrannosaurid family tree includes some smaller and more primitive relatives, and several of these, particularly Eutyrannus huali, a tyrannosauroid from the early Cretaceous of China, described in 2012, preserved clear evidence of long filamentous feather-like structures, covering much of the body. Eutyrannus was a substantial animal, about 9 meters long and roughly 1.4 metric tons, and it had feathers. Its very existence suggested that feathers might have been ancestral to all tyrannosauroids, inherited from a common ancestor. But then there is the skin evidence. Several specimens of adult Tyrannosaurus rex and closely related large tyrannosaurids preserve patches of scaly skin impression, particularly around the tail and the lower body. These impressions show no evidence of feathers, only small, pebbly scales. This has led many researchers to propose that adult Tyrannosaurus was secondarily scaly, that it had feathers as a juvenile, perhaps for insulation during the cold winters that the Hell Creek climate likely experienced, and then lost them as an adult, just as elephants and rhinoceroses lose most of their hair as they become large enough to retain body heat without insulation. The hypothesis is plausible and consistent with the available evidence. It means that a young Tyrannosaurus was probably covered in fuzzy protofeathers, making it look, to our eyes, oddly cuddly, while the adult was largely scaly, but perhaps retained feathers on the back and neck, where the skin impressions have not been found. The uncertainty here is important to acknowledge. We have some skin impressions from some parts of some Tyrannosaurus specimens. We do not have a complete skin impression of any individual. The regions where feathers might have been retained, the back, the top of the head, the arms, are precisely the regions where skin impressions are rarest. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty what a living adult Tyrannosaurus rex looked like, and anyone who tells you otherwise is overstating the evidence. What we can say is that it looked nothing like a modern lizard or crocodile, that it was far more bird-like than the old images suggested, and that the probability of at least some feathering somewhere on the body is higher than most popular reconstructions acknowledge. The single most famous individual Tyrannosaurus rex ever found has a name: Sue. The specimen now known as Sue, after the collector Sue Hendrickson, who found it in 1990, was recovered from the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota on the ranch of Maurice Williams. It is the largest, most complete, and best preserved Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton ever discovered, preserving approximately 90% of the complete skeleton. Its bones are enormous, and examining them tells a story that no textbook reconstruction ever fully captured. Sue's story has layers. The discovery was followed immediately by a legal dispute over ownership that became one of the most complicated and contentious cases in the history of American paleontology. The Federal Bureau of Investigation seized the specimen in 1992 on the grounds that Maurice Williams, whose land it had been found on, was a Native American whose property was held in federal trust, meaning the land technically belonged to the United States government. Not to Williams personally. The Black Hills Institute, which had excavated the specimen, had paid Williams $10,000 for it, a transaction that the federal government argued was invalid. The legal battle lasted years and involved the South Dakota Congressional Delegation, the FBI, various Native American tribal governments, and ultimately the Supreme Court. Sue was eventually auctioned at Sotheby's in 1997 and sold for $8.36 million to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, a figure that was at the time the highest price ever paid for a fossil at public auction. It remains one of the most expensive natural history objects ever sold. The specimen itself, once properly prepared and studied, yielded discoveries that changed understanding of Tyrannosaurus biology in several ways. The CT scanning of Sue's skull revealed the internal brain anatomy with unprecedented precision. The study of Sue's bone histology by Erickson and colleagues provided key data for the growth rate analysis that established the explosive juvenile growth phase. The pathological analysis of Sue's bones told a different kind of story. Sue had lived a hard life. The bones preserve evidence of trichomoniasis, a parasitic infection caused by a protozoan similar to the one that infects modern birds of prey, which had eaten through the lower jaw bones and likely caused severe feeding difficulties toward the end of the animal's life. Other bones show healed injuries, bites, broken ribs that had healed, foot injuries, Sue was old when it died, approximately 28 years based on the bone ring count, and its body was a record of a long, violent, complicated life in a world that was not kind. There is something very real about Sue's bone pathologies, something that reaches across 66 million years of time with a kind of intimacy that the grand geological narrative of the Hell Creek Formation rarely provides. This animal suffered. It was injured and it healed. It was parasitized and it survived for years with a damaged jaw. It navigated a world of enormous competitors and uncertain prey, and it persisted until it did not. The individual behind the famous skeleton was not a symbol or an icon. It was a creature with a body that hurt sometimes, that struggled, that endured. That is worth remembering. Peter Larson of the Black Hills Institute, who supervised the original excavation of Sue, has spent much of his career arguing that the specimen should have remained in South Dakota, close to the community and the landscape that produced it. The legal dispute and its resolution remain painful to him and to many in the paleontological community. But the scientific value of the specimen, now on permanent display in the Field Museum's Stanley Field Hall and accessible to millions of visitors every year, is undeniable. Sue changed what we know about Tyrannosaurus rex. It changed what we know about the Hell Creek world. And the price paid for it, in legal fees and scientific delay and community grief, is part of the story of how paleontology in America has always been entangled with questions of ownership, of who the deep past belongs to, and who has the right to excavate it. The answer to that last question, in the United States, has become increasingly complex over the last 30 years. On federal land, fossils are federal property and cannot be collected for private sale. On private land, they belong to the landowner. On Native American trust land, the situation is what the Sue case illustrated. And the relationship between commercial paleontology, academic paleontology, and the rights of indigenous communities whose ancestral territories these fossil beds underlie has been contested and is still being negotiated. The Lakota Sioux, whose sacred Black Hills region overlaps with much of the Hell Creek fossil territory, have a cultural relationship to the deep past of that landscape that has rarely been centered in the conventional scientific story. It is worth centering it now, at least briefly, because the bones in the ground belong to a landscape that has never belonged only to science. Everything we have discussed so far, the animals, the ecology, the revolutions in understanding, has been about the world before the end. But the Hell Creek Formation is inseparable from the question of the end itself, because it preserves the most detailed record ever found of what the world looked like immediately before the mass extinction. And in some localities, it preserves something even more extraordinary, evidence of the extinction event itself, preserved in the rock at a resolution of centimeters. The boundary between the Cretaceous period and the Paleogene period, universally abbreviated as the KPG boundary, represents one of the most abrupt and catastrophic events in the history of life on Earth. It is sometimes called the KT boundary in older literature, using the German Kreide for Cretaceous and Tertiary for the old name of the Paleogene, and you will still see this notation in papers published before the nomenclature was updated. By whatever name, it marks the moment, 66 million years ago, when approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth went extinct. The non-avian dinosaurs, every last one, were among the casualties. So were the marine reptiles, the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs that had dominated the Cretaceous seas. So were the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that had ruled the skies alongside the birds. So were the ammonites, those beautifully coiled cephalopods whose shells fill museum cases and are sold in rock shops around the world. The Cretaceous world was enormously diverse and ecologically complex, and in a geological instant, it was gone. The story of how we figured out what caused this extinction is one of the great scientific detective stories of the 20th century, and it begins not with a fossil, but with a thin, clay-rich layer of rock found at the KPG boundary at multiple sites around the world. In the late 1970s, a physicist named Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter were studying the KPG boundary layer at Gubbio in the Apennine Mountains of Italy, trying to use the concentration of iridium in the boundary clay to estimate how long the extinction interval had lasted. Iridium is a rare element in Earth's crust, but falls from space at a known, roughly constant rate in micrometeorites and cosmic dust. By measuring how much iridium had accumulated in the boundary clay, the Alvarezes hoped to calculate how many years the clay represented. What they found instead was not a small accumulation consistent with slow deposition. What they found was a spike, a sudden, enormous concentration of iridium in the boundary clay that was 30 times higher than the normal background level. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Iridium at that concentration, at that global distribution, could not have accumulated from normal cosmic dustfall. It had to have come from a single, catastrophic source. And the most plausible single source of that much iridium, delivered globally and simultaneously, was a large extraterrestrial impactor. An asteroid or comet that had struck the Earth with enough force to vaporize itself and scatter its material, including its iridium, around the entire planet. The Alvarezes published their hypothesis in 1980, and the scientific community's response was, initially, largely skeptical. The idea that a single asteroid impact had caused one of the greatest mass extinctions in Earth's history seemed dramatic, almost sensationalist, to geologists and paleontologists who had spent their careers thinking about gradual processes. The uniformitarianism that had dominated geology since Charles Lyell in the 19th century. The principle that the present is the key to the past, and that geological change is slow and steady, made catastrophic impacts feel philosophically uncomfortable. But the iridium anomaly was real, and it was found not just at Gubbio, but at KPG boundary sites around the world, dozens and eventually hundreds of them, always at the same stratigraphic level, always at the same enormous concentration relative to background. The evidence was not going away. Then, in 1991, the impact crater was found. The Chicxulub crater is buried beneath the sediments of the northwestern Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and beneath the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It had been identified in exploratory drilling data from the 1970s by geophysicists working for the Mexican national oil company Pemex, who noticed an unusual circular structure in the subsurface data, but had not recognized its significance. When Alan Hildebrand, a Canadian graduate student, connected the Chicxulub structure to the KPG impact hypothesis and published the identification in 1991, it transformed the debate. Here was the smoking gun, not metaphorically but literally. The buried scar of an asteroid approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter that had struck the Earth at approximately 20 kilometers per second, releasing an amount of energy roughly equivalent to 1 billion nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The Chicxulub impactor struck the shallow carbonate platform of what is now the Yucatan at an angle, probably from the northeast, and the consequences were immediate, global, and almost incomprehensible in their scale. The impact itself vaporized both the impactor and a substantial volume of the target rock, sending a plume of superheated debris and vaporized material into the upper atmosphere and beyond. Within minutes, ejecta was raining back down on the hemisphere of Earth, facing the impact site, each fragment entering the atmosphere at high velocity and heating the air through friction to temperatures that may have been sufficient to ignite wildfires across much of North America. Global wildfires may have burned for weeks. Within hours, the Chicxulub impact generated tsunamis of unprecedented scale. The Western Interior Seaway, that shallow inland sea dividing North America, experienced waves that likely reached hundreds of meters in height. In the geological record of sites around the Gulf of Mexico and along the paleo shorelines of the Western Interior Seaway, The KPG boundary contains chaotic layers of jumbled sediment, thrown together debris, the signatures of enormous waves that disrupted and redeposited vast quantities of material. The longer-term consequences were driven by what the impactor did to the atmosphere. The Yucatan target rock was particularly unfortunate in its composition. It was rich in carbonates and sulfates, and when those materials were vaporized and injected into the upper atmosphere, they produced enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide. The sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols that reflected sunlight and cooled the planet dramatically. Photosynthesis collapsed. The food web that depended on it collapsed with it. For months, possibly years, global temperatures dropped precipitously, plant productivity fell towards zero, and animals that depended on living plants had nothing to eat. It is this collapse of photosynthesis that was probably the primary killing mechanism for the large animals of the Hell Creek ecosystem. Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and Edmontosaurus did not die in the impact itself. Most of them were hundreds or thousands of kilometers from the impact site when it happened. They died in the months that followed, as the food web they depended on disintegrated. The large herbivores starved first. The large carnivores that depended on them starved next. The animals that survived were small, those that could live on seeds and invertebrates and organic detritus that persisted when green plants did not. Mammals survived primarily for this reason. Many birds survived, particularly those with seed-eating diets. Most non-avian dinosaurs did not. The Hell Creek Formation preserves this transition at extraordinary resolution in some localities. In 2019, a team led by Robert De Palma of the University of Kansas published a description of a site in North Dakota called Tanis. That may be the most extraordinary geological discovery since the Chicxulub crater itself. Tanis is a fossil site within the Hell Creek Formation in Bowman County, North Dakota, that preserves what appears to be a snapshot of the first hours after the Chicxulub impact. The site contains a jumbled layer of sediment, fish, plants, and other organisms deposited by what appears to have been a sudden, violent surge of water, almost certainly a seiche. A standing wave or oscillation generated in the western interior seaway by the seismic energy of the impact traveling through the Earth at the speed of sound. The seiche would have reached the Tanis site, a river delta feeding into the seaway, within the first hour after impact, possibly within minutes, long before any airborne ejector could have reached it. Yet within the chaotic sediment at Tanis, there are spherules, tiny glass beads formed when impact ejector re-entered the atmosphere and cooled into droplets that are found within the gills of fish, suggesting that those fish were still alive when the ejector rain began. If the Tanis interpretation is correct, and it remains somewhat controversial pending additional scrutiny and independent verification, then the site preserves organisms that were alive at the moment of impact and dead within the first hour. Their bodies swept together by the seiche and buried under the ejector layer that fell from the sky as the fish were still dying. It is a snapshot of the worst day in the history of life on Earth, preserved in stone in a badland in North Dakota, 66 million years later. De Palma and his colleagues have also reported the discovery at Tanis of what they believe may be a non-avian dinosaur skin impression associated with the impact layer, which would make it one of the very few physical traces of a dinosaur that can be directly connected to the extinction event itself. The paper announcing this discovery has been more cautiously received by the scientific community, and the interpretation is contested. But the site itself, the chaotic seiche deposit with its fish and spherules and extraordinary preservation, appears to be genuine. And if it is what it appears to be, it is one of the most important fossil sites ever discovered. The scientific debate around Tanis is a good illustration of how paleontology handles extraordinary claims. The bar for evidence is high precisely because the implications are so significant. Claims that appear to show impact, ejector, and fish gills require careful taphonomic analysis to rule out other explanations. Claims that a site represents the first hour of the extinction event require rigorous stratigraphic and geochemical work to confirm. De Palma and his colleagues have published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, and their evidence has been partially confirmed by independent researchers. The site continues to be excavated and studied, and whatever its ultimate interpretation, it is contributing genuinely new information about the events surrounding the KPG boundary. One of the most important contributors to understanding the KPG boundary in the Hell Creek region has been the work of paleobotanists, scientists who study fossil plants. Plants are perhaps the most sensitive indicators of environmental change in the fossil record, because they respond quickly to climate shifts and because pollen, which is nearly indestructible, preserves in sediment with remarkable fidelity. The pollen record from Hell Creek boundary sites shows a dramatic pattern. Below the KPG boundary, the pollen assemblage is diverse, representing the complex subtropical forest ecosystem of the Late Cretaceous. At the boundary itself, the pollen record shows a sudden collapse of diversity followed by a brief but distinctive spike in fern spores. Ferns are amongst the first plants to colonize disturbed ground after a catastrophe. In modern volcanic eruptions, ferns often form the first plant community on bare lava flows before the forest reassembles itself. The fern spike at the KPG boundary, found at dozens of sites across North America, is interpreted as exactly this: a pioneer community colonizing a landscape stripped of its forest by the impact-induced cooling and the wildfires that preceded it. Above the fern spike, plant diversity begins slowly to recover, with different species reflecting the different world rebuilding itself in the aftermath. The Hell Creek world, with its subtropical forests and its vast herds of hadrosaurs, was replaced over the following hundreds of thousands of years by a world dominated by early mammals and birds, its characteristic megafauna gone. This transition is visible in the rock as clearly as any boundary in the geological record. Walk up the cliff face at a Hell Creek exposure. Below the KPG boundary, you find dinosaur bones, dinosaur teeth, dinosaur tracks, the pollen of the Cretaceous forest. At the boundary itself, sometimes represented by a layer only centimeters thick, sometimes a discontinuous smear of grey or black clay, sometimes a bright red oxidized layer reflecting the burned landscape. There is iridium. There are spherules. There is the fern spike. Above the boundary, there are no more dinosaurs. Not fewer, none. The change is not gradual. It is absolute. To truly understand the Hell Creek formation, it is not enough to understand the giants. The giants are the most visible, the most studied, the most famous. But an ecosystem is not its largest animals. An ecosystem is the entire web of relationships between every living thing within it, from the largest predator to the smallest soil organism. And the Hell Creek formation preserves enough of that web to allow a genuine reconstruction of what the world looked like at almost every level of biological complexity. Begin with the plants, because everything starts with the plants. The vegetation of the Hell Creek world was different from any forest you could visit today, and yet it was recognizably a forest. The Late Cretaceous was the age of the first great flowering plant diversification. Angiosperms, the flowering plants that now dominate almost every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, had first appeared in the fossil record in the early Cretaceous, roughly 130 million years ago. And by the time of the Hell Creek formation, they had diversified into hundreds of families and were beginning to replace the older conifer-dominated vegetation in the warmer, lowland habitats. The Hell Creek fossil flora, studied extensively by the botanist Kirk Johnson of the Smithsonian Institution and his colleagues, shows a complex mosaic of vegetation types. Along the river margins and in the wet lowlands, dense stands of flowering trees and shrubs formed a riparian corridor, thick and green and humid. These communities included early relatives of magnolias, planes and other broadleaf trees, many of them with large, simple leaves, adapted to intercept the strong subtropical light. Ferns filled the understory in shadier areas. Along the riverbanks, reeds and horsetails formed dense stands at the water's edge. Moving away from the rivers and up the low ridges between drainage channels, the vegetation became more open, transitioning into communities dominated by conifers and cycads, plants with a much longer evolutionary history than the flowering trees of the riverbanks. The diversity of this vegetation was extraordinary. Johnson and his colleagues have identified more than 300 species of plants from the Hell Creek flora, a number that exceeds the plant diversity of many modern temperate forests. The ecological complexity that this diversity implies is enormous. Different plant species flower at different times. Different species produce different fruit and seed resources at different seasons. The mosaic of vegetation types across the landscape meant that different parts of the Hell Creek world offered different resources at different times of year. And an animal that could move between these habitat types, following the seasonal availability of food, would have had an enormous advantage. The hadrosaurs, the large duck-billed dinosaurs like Edmontosaurus, were almost certainly doing exactly this. Their teeth are extraordinary structures, nothing like the simple, generalized dentition of most large herbivores. The dental battery of a hadrosaur consists of hundreds of small, tightly packed teeth arranged in a self-sharpening grinding mill, with new teeth continuously growing in from below as the upper ones wear down. This arrangement is extremely efficient at processing tough, fibrous plant material. The specific plant material that hadrosaurs processed is revealed by isotopic analysis of their teeth and bones, and by the occasional spectacular preservation of gut contents. In 1999, a specimen of Edmontosaurus from the Hell Creek Formation was found with partially preserved stomach contents. The analysis of this material, published by Karen Chin of the University of Colorado and colleagues, showed that this individual had been eating conifer needles and twigs, along with fragments of flowering plant material and possibly seeds. This was not the soft aquatic vegetation that the old reconstructions assumed hadrosaurs consumed. It was tough, fibrous, woody material that required the grinding dental battery to process. Edmontosaurus was essentially a Cretaceous equivalent of a large browsing ungulate, a dietary generalist that could exploit the full range of plant resources available in its environment. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs of which Triceratops was the most abundant in the Hell Creek, had a very different dietary strategy. Their teeth were shearing blades, designed for cutting rather than grinding, and the beak at the front of the jaw was capable of snipping off tough vegetation at the base. Studies of Triceratops toothwear suggest that it was processing harder, more fibrous material than the hadrosaurs, possibly including palm fronds, ferns, and the tough stems of shrubs. The shearing dentition of ceratopsians appears to have been particularly well suited to plants defended by physical toughness rather than chemical deterrence. Ankylosaurs, represented in the Hell Creek Formation by Ankylosaurus magniventris, the most completely armored of all dinosaurs, had simpler teeth and apparently processed softer, low-growing vegetation. The body plan of Ankylosaurus, low and wide with short legs and a belly that hung close to the ground, suggests an animal that foraged close to the surface, cropping ground-level plants. The defensive armoring of Ankylosaurus, which covered essentially the entire dorsal surface of the animal in bony scutes and carried a massive, club-like tail capable of delivering a devastating blow to the ankle bones of an attacking Tyrannosaurus, suggests that it was not fast enough to flee predators, but well enough armored to stand its ground. The tail club of Ankylosaurus was not a passive defensive structure. Biomechanical analysis by Victoria Arbour of the Royal Ontario Museum has shown that the tail was capable of generating forces sufficient to shatter bone, and that it could be swung laterally with considerable speed. The armored dinosaurs of the Hell Creek world occupied a dietary niche roughly equivalent to a modern grazing animal, and their presence in the ecosystem contributed to the structure of the vegetation in ways that we can only guess at but that were almost certainly significant. Large herbivores shape vegetation through their feeding. They create openings in the canopy by breaking branches and toppling saplings. They create pathways through dense undergrowth by their passage. They fertilize the soil with their waste and, in death, with their bodies. An ecosystem that included herds of Edmontosaurus and Triceratops, and individuals of Ankylosaurus, was an ecosystem with a vegetation structure partly defined by those animals, partly maintained by them, and deeply dependent on their presence. When they disappeared, the vegetation would have changed, and not merely because the impact-induced darkness killed the plants. It would have changed because the animals that had been maintaining it were gone. The rivers of the Hell Creek world were as ecologically complex as the land. The freshwater fauna preserved in the formation is rich and well studied, and it tells a story of aquatic communities that rivaled any modern river system in their diversity. Crocodilians were abundant and diverse in the Hell Creek rivers. At least 5 genera of crocodilians have been described from the formation, ranging from the small, fast-running Borealosuchus, whose limb proportions suggest it was capable of terrestrial pursuit in a way that modern crocodilians are not, to the enormous Dinosuchus, which had disappeared by the end of the Cretaceous, but whose Hell Creek relatives were large, powerful ambush predators in the traditional crocodilian mold. The crocodilians of the Hell Creek rivers were not passive bystanders. They were significant predators of any animal that came to the water's edge to drink, including juvenile dinosaurs small enough to be seized and drowned. Crocodilian bite marks have been found on Hell Creek dinosaur bones, confirming direct predator-prey interactions. The turtles of the Hell Creek Formation are extraordinarily diverse, representing both aquatic and semi-terrestrial species. Atticus and Basilamis were large, side-necked turtles that lived in the rivers and lakes. Trionyx, a soft-shelled turtle closely related to the species still living in North American rivers today, was present and apparently common. The Hell Creek turtles are, in fact, among the best evidence we have for the ecological disruption of the KPG extinction, because turtles have an extraordinary survival record. Their metabolism is low, their dietary needs are modest, and they are capable of surviving in low productivity environments that would starve larger animals. Many Hell Creek turtle lineages crossed the KPG boundary and survived into the Paleogene. The turtles are, in this sense, the quiet survivors of the Hell Creek story, the creatures that neither ruled the world nor lost everything when it ended, but simply persisted, as turtles have been persisting for more than 200 million years. The fish fauna of the Hell Creek rivers was equally rich. Lepisostides, the gauze, were present and would be recognizable to any modern fisherman in the American South. Bowfins, pycnodonts, and various ray-finned fish filled the rivers and were important food resources for the crocodilians, the larger wading birds, and probably the small mammals of the riverbank communities. The aquatic ecosystems of the Hell Creek world were, in essence, modern-looking. A fish-based food web supporting larger aquatic and semi-aquatic predators, embedded in a landscape of riparian forest and open floodplain. The small vertebrates of the Hell Creek Formation are less glamorous than the giants, but they are scientifically crucial, because it is in the small vertebrates that the story of the KPG extinction and its survivors plays out most clearly. Paleontologist William Clemens of the University of California, Berkeley, spent decades studying the microvertebrate faunas of the Hell Creek and adjacent formations, carefully sieving sediment through fine mesh to recover the tiny teeth and bones that fall out of the large-scale excavations. The picture he assembled over those decades is of a small vertebrate community of considerable diversity, with multiple species of lizards, snakes, salamanders, frogs, and small mammals occupying the understory of the Hell Creek world. The lizard fauna of the Hell Creek Formation includes ancestors of modern monitor lizards, skinks, and anguimorphs, along with the mosasaur relatives that were, by the end of the Cretaceous, producing the massive marine predators of the Western Interior Seaway. On land, the lizards occupied insectivore and small carnivore niches, and their diversity is a good index of the overall health and complexity of the ecosystem. The snake fauna, while less diverse than the lizard fauna, includes early members of the modern snake radiation, and their presence suggests that the dense undergrowth of the Hell Creek forest harbored enough small vertebrate prey to support a community of elongate stealth predators. The salamander fauna is particularly interesting because salamanders are sensitive indicators of freshwater habitat quality. Hell Creek salamanders include members of genera that are still living today, unchanged in their basic body plan after 66 million years, one of the longest records of morphological stasis in the vertebrate fossil record. The frogs, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The frogs of the Hell Creek, similarly, include forms closely related to living species, and their presence in abundance throughout the formation suggests that the wetland and riverine habitats of the Late Cretaceous coastal plain were productive and well watered, as the botanical evidence also indicates. And then, there are the mammals. We have already met them briefly, those small, furtive creatures sheltering in the undergrowth, while the great dinosaurs dominated the landscape above them. But they deserve a more careful look, because they were not as uniform or as ecologically marginal as the old picture suggested. The multituberculates, named for the multiple cusps on their molar teeth, were the most successful mammalian group of the Mesozoic era. They had first appeared in the Jurassic, roughly 165 million years ago, and they were still present and diverse in the Hell Creek world. Their dentition is remarkably similar to that of modern rodents, a coincidence that led early naturalists to classify some of them with the rodents before the true affinities were worked out. They had the same general dietary flexibility as rodents, feeding on seeds, insects, soft plant material, and probably small vertebrates when they could catch them. The multituberculate Mesodma, common in Hell Creek fossil microvertebrate samples, was roughly the size of a large mouse and probably lived in a similar ecological niche. The placentals and marsupials of the Hell Creek formation are represented by several genera, all of them small and insectivorous in their general body plan. The marsupials, represented primarily by Alphodon and related forms, were generalized omnivores, whose dental morphology suggests diets of insects, soft plant material, and possibly small vertebrates. The earliest placental mammals of the Hell Creek are known from fragmentary specimens that have been the subject of considerable taxonomic debate. The most significant of these is the genus Purgatorius, known from isolated teeth, which some researchers place just below the KPG boundary in the Hell Creek formation, and which may represent the earliest known primate or a close relative of the primate lineage. If Purgatorius was indeed present in the Hell Creek world, then the lineage that would eventually give rise to monkeys, apes, and humans was already alive in the shadow of the last dinosaurs. The evidence is fragmentary and the identification contested, but the possibility is worth holding in mind that somewhere in the undergrowth of the Late Cretaceous forest, in what is now Montana, a small, nondescript, insectivorous mammal was going about its small life, unaware that it was the beginning of a story that would eventually produce you. The individual animals of the Hell Creek formation have stories that reward close attention. Science tends toward the general, toward populations and species and statistical trends, because that is where the reliable signal lives. But the individual specimens are where the story becomes personal, where the distance of 66 million years collapses for a moment into something almost immediate. Stan, formerly designated BHI 3033, is the second most complete Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton ever found, and in some ways, the most scientifically important. discovered in 1892 by amateur collector Stan Sackerson near Buffalo, South Dakota, and properly excavated by the Black Hills Institute beginning in 1992, Stan has provided more detailed information about Tyrannosaurus biology, pathology, and individual life history than almost any other specimen. The skull of Stan is particularly well preserved, and its preparation revealed evidence of multiple healed bite wounds that have been studied in detail by William Abler and others. Some of these wounds appear to match the spacing and shape of Tyrannosaurus teeth precisely, suggesting that Stan had been bitten on the head by another Tyrannosaurus. This is not unusual behavior in large predators. Modern Komodo dragons bite each other in intraspecific combat. Lions injure each other in territorial fights. The evidence from Stan suggests that Tyrannosaurus rex engaged in similar behaviors, that individuals interacted with enough force to leave lasting marks on each other's skulls, and that at least some of those encounters resulted in injuries severe enough to penetrate bone. The wounds on Stan's skull had healed, which means Stan survived whatever confrontation produced them. One bite mark appears to have penetrated the bone and then sealed over with new growth, a process that would have taken months. Stan was injured, it recovered, and it continued living. The pathological record of individual specimens is, in this way, a window into the social and competitive lives of these animals that skeleton alone cannot provide. Scotty, held at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum and sometimes designated by its institutional catalogue number, was excavated from the Hell Creek Formation near eastern Saskatchewan, Canada, and described formally in 2019 by Scott Persons and colleagues. Scotty is significant because it appears to be the largest Tyrannosaurus rex specimen yet described, with a body mass estimated at approximately 8.8 metric tons based on limb bone circumference measurements. It is also old. The bone histology places its age at roughly 28 years at death, near the upper limit of the known Tyrannosaurus lifespan. Scotty's bones preserve evidence of a remarkable number of pathological conditions: a damaged fibula that had healed and then been re-injured, a rib that had broken and healed, an infected tooth socket, and various other lesions that speak to a long and difficult life. Persons, in describing the specimen, noted that Scotty appeared to have been a particularly hard-lived individual, even by the tough standards of late Cretaceous apex predators. Jane is a different kind of specimen. Discovered in 2001 by Burpee Museum collectors in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, Jane is a small, lightly built tyrannosaurid that provoked immediate debate about its taxonomic identity. Some researchers argued that Jane was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex, consistent with Horner's ontogenetic arguments about the growth series of tyrannosaurids. Others argued that Jane's anatomy was distinct enough to represent a separate, smaller species, tentatively referred to Nanotyrannus lancensis. The Nanotyrannus debate has been ongoing for decades and has not been definitively resolved. The specimen described as Nanotyrannus was originally assigned by scientists in the 1946, and the debate was revived when additional specimens were found. Recent work by Carr and colleagues has argued forcefully, based on detailed bone histology and skull morphology, that all known Nanotyrannus specimens are juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex individuals. Other researchers remain unconvinced. The significance of this debate extends beyond taxonomic tidying. If Nanotyrannus is a real, distinct species, then the Hell Creek Formation had two tyrannosaurid predators occupying somewhat different niches: a small, agile pursuit predator in Nanotyrannus and the massive ambush and bulk predator of adult Tyrannosaurus. If Nanotyrannus specimens are juvenile Tyrannosaurus, then the growth series of that species shows a predator that dramatically changed its ecological role across its lifetime, beginning as a small, fast, agile predator in its youth, and transforming into a massive, slow, powerful animal as an adult. Both possibilities are interesting, both have implications for understanding how the Hell Creek Predator Guild functioned. The evidence, as of the moment of writing, favors the juvenile Tyrannosaurus interpretation, but the debate is still active. The Wankel Rex, catalogued at the Museum of the Rockies under an institutional specimen number, was found in 1988 by amateur fossil hunter Kathy Wankel on federal land in eastern Montana. It was one of the most complete Tyrannosaurus rex specimens known at the time of its discovery, and its excavation by Jack Horner's team from the Museum of the Rockies was technically challenging because of the remote location and the large size of the bones. The Wankel Rex is notable in the history of Hell Creek paleontology, partly because of the extended legal dispute over its ownership, which predated the SUE controversy, and established some of the legal precedents that would later shape that case. After decades in Montana, the Wankel Rex was transferred to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., where it is now on permanent display, and the Museum of the Rockies retained a high-quality cast. The specimen's transfer was itself contested, and reflected the ongoing tensions between regional scientific institutions and national ones over the disposition of federally owned fossils. The debate about whether Tyrannosaurus rex was primarily a predator or primarily a scavenger reached its most public and entertaining phase in the 1990s and 2000s, driven largely by Jack Horner, who argued provocatively that Tyrannosaurus was an obligate scavenger, incapable of active predation and dependent entirely on the carcasses of animals that died by other means. Horner's argument rested on several anatomical features. The tiny, seemingly non-functional arms, which could not reach the mouth and would have been useless in prey capture. The forward-facing eyes with their exceptional binocular vision, which in modern scavengers like vultures is associated with detecting carcasses at long range. The enormous olfactory bulbs, which Horner argued were an adaptation for detecting the smell of rotting meat from great distances, and the lack of any direct fossil evidence of predatory behavior. The argument was clever and provocative, and it served Horner's characteristic purpose of forcing the field to examine its assumptions. But the evidence against it accumulated rapidly. The binocular vision of Tyrannosaurus, studies of modern animals suggested, was actually more consistent with active predation than with scavenging. Ambush predators like owls and cats have forward-facing eyes, as do pursuit predators like eagles, precisely because depth perception aids in judging the distance to a moving target. The olfactory capacity, while certainly useful for finding carcasses, is equally useful for detecting the scent of living prey at distance. And then there are the coprolites. Coprolites are fossil feces, and they preserve what went into an animal at the back end with the same fidelity that gut contents preserve what went in at the front. Karen Chin, the same researcher who analysed the Edmontosaurus gut contents, described a large coprolite from the Hell Creek Formation of Saskatchewan in 1998 that contained fragments of Triceratops bone, heavily digested but identifiable. The size and shape of the coprolite was consistent with Tyrannosaurus, and the bone fragments inside it showed evidence of crushing by powerful jaws. This evidence suggested that Tyrannosaurus was consuming Triceratops remains, though it did not definitively prove that it had killed the animal rather than scavenged it. More direct evidence came from Triceratops bones bearing healed Tyrannosaurus bite marks. If Tyrannosaurus had bitten a Triceratops, and the animal had survived long enough for the bone to heal, then Tyrannosaurus had attacked a living Triceratops. The healing could only occur in a living animal. These specimens, described by various researchers in the 2000s, effectively ended the serious scientific debate about scavenging. The consensus is now that Tyrannosaurus was an active predator that also scavenged opportunistically, like virtually every large carnivore alive today. The arms remain unexplained in detail, though various hypotheses have been offered, including their use in mating behavior or in rising from a prone position. They were small relative to the body, but the muscle attachments suggest they were not weak, and their function in the living animal remains genuinely uncertain. The pachycephalosaurs of the Hell Creek Formation represent one of the more unusual corners of the late Cretaceous world. Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis, the largest and most famous member of the group, had a skull modified into a massive dome of solid bone up to 25 centimeters thick. The purpose of this dome has been debated for decades. The traditional interpretation that male pachycephalosaurs butted heads like modern bighorn sheep has been challenged on biomechanical grounds, because the dome is oriented to resist axial forces only if the animal held its neck in a specific curved posture, and the neck anatomy of Pachycephalosaurus does not appear well adapted for absorbing the impact of head-on collisions. An alternative hypothesis, advanced by Mark Goodwin and Jack Horner, proposed that Pachycephalosaurs butted the flanks of opponents rather than their heads, in a style similar to musk oxen. Yet another hypothesis suggests that the dome was primarily a display structure rather than a combat weapon. The debate remains unresolved, but what is not debated is the variation in dome thickness across the growth series. Juvenile Pachycephalosaurs had flat, thin skulls that developed the thick dome only as the animal matured, a pattern consistent with a secondary sexual characteristic. The Hell Creek Pachycephalosaurs were, in this reading, animals with a complex social life in which physical appearance played a significant role. Thescelosaurus neglectus is one of the least glamorous inhabitants of the Hell Creek Formation, a small bipedal herbivore roughly the size and general body plan of a large dog, with a modestly designed skeleton that attracted little scientific attention for decades after its description in 1913. Its very species name, neglectus, meaning neglected, was chosen by its describer Charles Gilmore to acknowledge that the specimen had sat in a museum drawer for years before being formally described. For most of the 20th century, Thescelosaurus was the kind of dinosaur that appeared in books only in lists of less important species. Then, in 2000, Paul Fisher and Ann Weil published a description of a Thescelosaurus specimen from the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota that preserved, they argued, an impression of the heart. The paper, published in Science, claimed that the preserved structure was a 4-chambered heart with a single systemic aorta, a feature found in birds and mammals, but not in modern reptiles, and interpreted this as evidence that Thescelosaurus had a high-pressure, high-flow circulatory system consistent with a warm-blooded, active physiology. The paper attracted enormous attention and was reported widely in the popular press. The subsequent scientific response was more measured. Several researchers published critiques arguing that the preserved structure was more consistent with a sandstone concretion that had formed around the chest cavity after death than with a genuine cardiac impression. The interpretation has remained controversial, and most paleontologists today are cautious about the cardiac evidence. But the episode is useful for what it illustrates about the scientific process. A small, neglected dinosaur from an overlooked drawer in a museum produced one of the most widely discussed papers of the decade, simply because someone looked at it carefully and asked a new question. The Hell Creek Formation is full of specimens that have been waiting for someone to look at them with a new question in mind, and the field continues to find that those questions produce answers. The history of women in Hell Creek paleontology is only beginning to be told fully, and it deserves at least a moment of recognition. Sue Hendrickson, who found the specimen named for her, was a professional fossil hunter and diver who had spent years working in the American West before the morning in 1990 when she walked across a hill in South Dakota and found an ankle bone the size of a cinder block eroding from a cliff face. Her discovery of SUE is one of the most consequential moments in the history of American paleontology. And it came not from a university laboratory, but from a lifetime of patient, skilled fieldwork by a self-taught collector. The legal dispute that followed her discovery effectively erased her from the public narrative of the specimen for years, and she received no financial benefit from its eventual sale. The specimen bears her name, and her contribution to paleontology is genuine. But the fuller story of her experience is not a comfortable one. Marion Brandvold, who led Horner and Michaela to the Maiasaura nesting site, was a rock shop owner in Bynum, Montana, whose sharp eyes and knowledge of the local Badlands made one of the most important behavioral discoveries in dinosaur paleontology possible. Kathy Wankel found the Wankel Rex during a family camping trip and reported it to the Bureau of Land Management as the law required, setting in motion an excavation that produced a specimen now in the Smithsonian. These women were not anomalies. The history of discovery in the Hell Creek Formation is full of people whose contributions were channeled through institutions that did not always acknowledge them equitably. The modern generation of Hell Creek researchers includes women at every level, from graduate students to senior faculty, and the field is gradually reckoning with its historical biases. Paleontology has been slower in this than some sciences, but the discipline is changing. The fossils do not care who finds them. The story of the KPG extinction has a villain in the Chicxulub impactor, and villains make for satisfying stories. But the scientific reality is, as usual, more complex than the dominant narrative suggests, and the complexity matters because it changes how we understand both the extinction itself and the world that preceded it. The question of whether the KPG extinction was entirely the work of the Chicxulub impact, or whether other factors contributed, has been debated since the impact hypothesis was first proposed, and it remains an active area of research. The most serious competing or complementary factor is volcanism on a continental scale, specifically the eruptions of the Deccan Traps in what is now west-central India. The Deccan Traps are one of the largest volcanic provinces on Earth, a vast outpouring of basaltic lava that covered approximately 500,000 square kilometers of the Indian subcontinent to an average depth of more than 2 kilometers. The total volume of lava erupted is estimated at roughly 1 million cubic kilometers. The Deccan eruptions occurred over an interval spanning roughly 1 million years, centered on the KPG boundary, though the most intense phase of eruption may have been considerably shorter. These eruptions, like all large-scale volcanism, injected massive quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that drives warming. Sulfur dioxide produces aerosols that cause short-term cooling. The volcanic record of the Deccan Traps therefore suggests a prolonged period of climate instability, with pulses of warming and cooling in the million years leading up to and following the KPG boundary. Paul Wignall of the University of Leeds and others have argued that the Deccan volcanism was a significant contributor to the KPG extinction, and that the world of the Late Cretaceous was already under environmental stress before the Chicxulub impact delivered the final blow. In this interpretation, the extinction was not a single event, but a compound crisis, a world already weakened by volcanic climate forcing that was then struck by an impactor whose effects would have been catastrophic under any circumstances, but were perhaps more so because of the preceding stress. The counter-argument, made forcefully by researchers including Jan Smit of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and Paul Schulte and colleagues in a major synthesis paper in 2010, is that the stratigraphic evidence from around the world shows the extinction happening precisely at the iridium anomaly layer, not gradually across the million years preceding it. If the Deccan volcanism had been causing significant extinction pressure for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact, you would expect to see a gradual decline in diversity in the fossil record leading up to the KPG boundary. In most major groups, you do not see this. The diversity appears approximately constant until the boundary layer, and then it collapses. This argument involves a subtlety called the Signor-Lipps effect, named for the paleontologists Philip Signor and Ger Lipps, who first described it in 1982. The Signor-Lipps effect refers to the systematic tendency in the fossil record for the last known occurrence of any extinct species to appear earlier in the stratigraphic section than the species' actual extinction. This happens because fossilization is a sampling process. Not every individual of every species is preserved. If a species goes extinct abruptly, you will typically find its last fossil specimen a bit below the actual extinction level, simply because specimens from the final generations of the species may not have been preserved or found. This creates an artificial appearance of gradual decline even when the extinction was actually sudden. Accounting for the Signe-Lipps effect when interpreting the Hell Creek fossil record requires statistical analysis of the entire known specimen distribution, not simply looking at the stratigraphic range of individual species. When this kind of analysis has been applied to Hell Creek taxa, the results have generally supported the sudden, catastrophic interpretation. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Work by Peter Sheehan, David Fastovsky, and colleagues at the Milwaukee Public Museum in the 1990s and 2000s used extensive surface collecting from measured stratigraphic sections in the Hell Creek Formation to track the diversity and abundance of dinosaur fossils through the last 2 million years of the Cretaceous. Their conclusion was that dinosaur diversity was approximately constant through most of the Hell Creek Formation, and showed no significant decline before the KPG boundary. The dinosaurs were not going extinct gradually. They appear to have been thriving up to the moment of the impact, and then they were gone. This conclusion has been challenged by John Archibald and colleagues, who have argued that the apparent stability of diversity near the KPG boundary may be partly an artifact of preservation and sampling bias, and that a more careful stratigraphic analysis reveals some decline in the last 100,000 years or so before the boundary. The debate has not produced a definitive resolution, but the weight of evidence, as of the current state of the literature, suggests that while the Deccan volcanism may have contributed to background environmental stress, the primary and proximate cause of the KPG mass extinction was the Chicxulub impact. There is something worth pausing on in this debate. It is not merely an academic dispute about what killed the dinosaurs. It is a dispute about the nature of catastrophe itself, about whether the world ends through gradual accumulation of stress or through sudden blows, and about the relationship between the two. The answer the Hell Creek Formation gives is not entirely satisfying in either direction. The world of the Late Cretaceous was changing. The western interior seaway was shrinking as the continent rose. The climate was fluctuating, the Deccan traps were erupting, but the non-avian dinosaurs appear to have been navigating these changes successfully, maintaining their diversity, filling their ecological roles, doing what successful lineages do. They did not see the asteroid coming. They could not have. And when it came, it did not give the world time to adapt. It simply ended the chapter. One of the questions that the Hell Creek Formation is uniquely positioned to answer, and that it has only partially answered so far, is what the last months and years of the Hell Creek world actually look like in experiential terms. Not statistically, not in terms of species diversity curves, but in terms of what it was like to be in that world in the years immediately preceding the impact. The vegetation was lush, the rivers were running, the hadrosaur herds were moving through the floodplains, following the seasonal patterns of plant growth. Young Tyrannosaurus were hunting in the dense riverine vegetation, targeting prey small enough to be caught by an animal that could still sprint. Old Tyrannosaurus were doing whatever old Tyrannosaurus did, which from the pathology record appears to have involved a good deal of rest and opportunistic feeding. Triceratops were gathering in groups, their elaborate frills catching the subtropical light. Pterosaurs were riding thermals above the plains, the enormous Quetzalcoatlus with its 11-meter wingspan visible from enormous distances as it soared above the coastal plain in search of large prey or carcasses. The seasons turned, the rains came and the rivers rose and the floodplains flooded. The rains ended and the rivers fell back to their channels and the floodplains dried. Seeds fell and germinated. Insects emerged. The entire complex machinery of the ecosystem ran on, as it had been running for millions of years, each part dependent on every other part. Each animal finding its place in a web of relationships older than any individual member of it. And somewhere, perhaps in September of what is now called 66 million years ago, though the exact date is not known within years or even thousands of years, a rock roughly the size of Mount Everest, traveling at 20 kilometers per second, entered the atmosphere above what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The impact was instantaneous in geological terms. The rock did not slow meaningfully as it entered the atmosphere. The atmosphere is thin, and the rock was large and fast. It struck the surface, and the energy released in that instant was so far beyond any human scale of reference that comparison becomes difficult. In the first seconds after impact, a column of superheated rock and vapor rose into the stratosphere and beyond. The ground shook at a scale and distance that exceeded any earthquake in recorded human history. The western interior seaway began to slosh, its surface disturbed by the seismic waves traveling through the earth at the speed of sound, generating the siege that would within minutes reach the Tanis site in North Dakota. In the Hell Creek world, the impact itself may have been visible as a sudden brightening in the southern sky, a flash of extraordinary intensity. Seismic waves would have reached Montana within minutes, shaking the ground, perhaps startling animals in mid-step. The ejecta rain, the spherules falling back from orbit, would have begun falling perhaps an hour later, heating the atmosphere enough in concentrated regions to start fires. The tsunami-equivalent effects in the nearby western interior seaway would have been severe for any animals living along its shorelines. But for an animal standing in the forests of what is now Montana, watching that southern brightness and feeling the ground shake, the worst was still coming. It was coming as a cooling, as a darkness, as the gradual failure of the food web. It was coming over weeks and months, not in a single terrible moment. And there was nothing to do but eat until there was nothing to eat, and then slowly, one by one, stop eating at all. The survivors did not know they had survived. Survival, in this context, was not an achievement. It was an accident. The small mammals in their burrows, the seed-eating birds in the dense undergrowth, the turtles in the river mud, did not sense that the world had changed in any fundamental way in the early weeks after the impact. They sensed darkness and cold, and the failure of the plants they depended on. Some of them found seeds and insects in the cold litter of the forest floor. Some found each other. Some survived that way, by accident, through no virtue of their own, simply by being small enough and flexible enough to extract enough energy from a dying world to keep their hearts beating through the long winter. And when the sky cleared and the light returned, and the ferns began to grow in the ruins of the old forest, those survivors were still there, and they had the whole world to themselves. The early Paleocene is preserved in the Fort Union Formation just above the Hell Creek in the Badlands of Montana and the Dakotas. It is a world that looks, at first glance, like the one before it. There are rivers, there are floodplains, there is vegetation, though it is different, less diverse, recovering slowly from the impact winter. There are small vertebrates, and more of them than before, but the giants are gone. The horizon is empty of the enormous shapes that had defined the Cretaceous landscape. The world has become, in an ecological sense, smaller. And then, slowly, the mammals begin to grow. Not in the first years, not in the first centuries, but over the first million years of the Paleocene, the mammalian lineages that survived the extinction begin to produce larger and larger descendants. The first large-hoofed mammals appear. The first large-bodied carnivorous mammals appear. Within 10 million years of the extinction, the mammals have replaced the non-avian dinosaurs in most of the large body niches that those animals had occupied for 165 million years. It is not an instant replacement. It is a slow, contingent, unpredictable diversification driven by the same forces of natural selection that had always operated, now working on a world with empty ecological space waiting to be filled. The birds are part of this story too. The avian dinosaurs that survived the extinction begin, in the Paleocene, to diversify into new ecological roles. Some of them become large and flightless, filling herbivore and even predator niches in a way that the non-avian dinosaur lineage of birds had never previously occupied. The terror birds of South America, the Gastornidae of Europe and North America, and the extinct Retite lineages all represent avian experiments with large body size and flightlessness that flourished in the post-extinction world. None of them dominated the way the non-avian dinosaurs had. The mammals proved better competitors in most large animal niches, for reasons that are still not entirely understood. But for tens of millions of years, there was a genuine contest between the birds and the mammals for ecological supremacy, and the birds won in some regions for a very long time. The ecological story of the post-KPG world is, ultimately, a story about opportunity and contingency. The opportunity was the empty ecological space left by the extinction. The contingency was everything else: which lineages happened to survive, what abilities they happened to have, which directions evolution happened to take them in the specific environmental conditions of the early Paleocene. Nothing about the modern world was inevitable. The dominance of mammals was not foreordained by any quality of mammalian biology. It was the result of a specific historical sequence of events: the asteroid, the extinction, the particular survivors, the particular environmental recovery that could easily have gone differently at a dozen branch points. This contingency is, in a strange way, the most important lesson of the Hell Creek Formation. It is a lesson in the arbitrariness of outcomes, in the difference between what happened and what might have happened. The Hell Creek world was a successful world by any ecological measure. It had been running effectively for millions of years. It was, on the day the asteroid struck, at the peak of its complexity and diversity, and it ended not because it had failed, but because the universe is not structured to reward success. The universe is indifferent. It produces catastrophes without warning. It ends successful experiments without prejudice. The only response to this knowledge that seems adequate, lying here in the dark, is a kind of gratitude. Gratitude that the accident of the asteroid happened in the particular way it did. Gratitude that the small, frightened seed-eating mammals in their burrows happened to survive. Gratitude for the long, improbable, contingent chain of events that led from those survivors to everything alive today, including you. The sky of the Hell Creek world has received less attention than the land, but it was no less remarkable. By the latest Cretaceous, the pterosaurs, those extraordinary flying reptiles that had dominated the skies of the Mesozoic alongside the birds, had been evolving for 160 million years, and they had reached, in the Hell Creek world, their maximum diversity and their maximum size. Quetzalcoatlus northropi is one of the most improbable animals that ever existed. Named for the Aztec feathered serpent deity by its describer Douglas Lawson in 1975, Quetzalcoatlus had a wingspan estimated variously at 10 to 11 meters, roughly the size of a small aircraft, and stood, when on the ground, approximately 5 meters tall at the shoulder, as tall as a modern giraffe. It was the largest known flying animal in the history of life on Earth. How it flew, and whether it could fly at all given its size, has been debated extensively, and still generates competing analyses. The most recent biomechanical modeling, by Mark Witten of the University of Portsmouth and Michael Habib of the University of Southern California, suggests that Quetzalcoatlus was a capable flyer that launched itself with a powerful quadrupedal jump, using all 4 limbs simultaneously to spring into the air before unfurling its wings. Once airborne, it was probably a highly efficient soaring animal, using thermals and updrafts to travel enormous distances at low metabolic cost. On the ground, Quetzalcoatlus was likely a stalking predator, moving on 4 limbs through open habitats and striking at prey with its long, spear-like beak. Witten and Habib have proposed that it hunted in a manner similar to a modern heron or stork, wading through shallow water or stalking across floodplains in search of fish, small vertebrates, and possibly juvenile dinosaurs small enough to be seized and swallowed. An animal the size of a giraffe, capable of flight, hunting on foot across the floodplains of Late Cretaceous Montana, is so improbable that it requires several consecutive moments of imagining before it becomes real. But it was there. The bones are in the rock. Smaller pterosaurs also inhabited the Hell Creek world, though the record is fragmentary. Nyctosaurus and other ornithocheiroids are known from the western interior seaways' Late Cretaceous deposits, and it is reasonable to infer that the Hell Creek skies included smaller pterosaurs fishing along the rivers and in the coastal environments near the seaway shoreline. The pterosaur fauna of the very latest Cretaceous is actually poorly known compared to the earlier Cretaceous, and this is partly a genuine ecological pattern, with pterosaur diversity apparently declining in the last 10 million years of the Cretaceous as birds diversified into more of the small-bodied flying niches, and partly an artifact of preservation, with the fragile bones of smaller pterosaurs simply not surviving as frequently as the bones of larger animals. The birds that shared the Hell Creek sky with Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives were already recognizably modern in many of their groups. Ichthyornis, a toothed bird about the size of a modern tern that had been described by Marsh in the 19th century from Kansas Cretaceous deposits, was representative of a grade of early birds that retained ancestral features like teeth, while already having the flight apparatus of modern birds. In the Hell Creek itself, the bird fauna is less well known, but includes forms comparable to modern shorebirds and small woodland birds. The avian diversity of the very latest Cretaceous was in transition, with some ancient lineages persisting and some modern ones beginning to emerge, a moment of evolutionary flux preserved in teeth and hollow bones in the Badlands rock. The practice of field paleontology in the Hell Creek region has developed its own culture over more than a century of continuous work. And that culture is worth describing, because it shapes what we know and what we do not know as much as any single discovery does. The Badlands of Montana and the Dakotas are remote, hot in summer, and brutally cold in winter, and the work of finding and excavating fossils in them is physically demanding in ways that romanticized portrayals rarely convey accurately. A typical Hell Creek field season runs from late May through August, when the days are long enough and the weather predictable enough for sustained outdoor work. Crews of between 5 and 20 people, typically including a mix of professional paleontologists, graduate and undergraduate students, and trained volunteers, work in shifts across measured sections of the formation. The basic method of surface prospecting has not changed fundamentally since the days of Barnum Brown and Sternberg. You walk the slopes slowly, looking at the surface of the rock, watching for the characteristic dark brown or chocolate color of dinosaur bone against the lighter matrix, for the subtle texture of mineralized trabecular bone, for the angular shapes that do not match the random weathering patterns of the rock around them. You learn the surface. You learn what bone looks like from every angle and at every state of weathering. And you spend a great deal of time looking at things that are not bone before you find the things that are. When a specimen is found, the process of excavation begins with careful mapping and documentation. Every fossil find is photographed in situ before anything is moved. The matrix around the bone is carefully removed using dental picks, air scribes, and brushes, working inward from the edges of the exposed bone toward the interior, following the shape of the fossil rather than imposing a shape on it. Bones that are fragile are consolidated with preservatives before they are fully exposed. Large specimens are undercut and removed in plaster field jackets, blocks of plaster-wrapped burlap that protect the specimen during transport to the laboratory, where the final and most delicate preparation work is done. The laboratory work, the removal of the last millimeters of matrix from a delicate fossil surface, is in many ways the most skilled part of the entire process, and it is the part least seen by the public. Preparators working with air abrasives and microscopes spend months or years on a single large specimen. The quality of the science that can subsequently be done on the specimen depends directly on the quality of the preparation. A poorly prepared specimen with matrix left on joint surfaces or delicate structures damaged by over-aggressive cleaning is a specimen from which less information can be extracted. The great preparators of the 20th century, people like Matt Smith at the Black Hills Institute and Bob Masek at the Museum of the Rockies, were and are genuinely skilled scientists whose contribution to the knowledge base of Hell Creek paleontology is enormous. Modern technology has transformed the analytical side of the work in ways that would have seemed miraculous to the collectors of the 19th century. Computed tomography, the same CT scanning used in medical imaging, has been adapted for paleontological specimens, allowing researchers to peer inside fossil bones and skulls without cutting them open. CT scanning has revealed the inner ear anatomy of dinosaurs, the structure of their brains, the internal growth structure of their bones, and the presence of features like the unusually large olfactory bulbs of Tyrannosaurus that could not have been assessed from surface examination alone. Three-dimensional scanning of fossil surfaces has allowed the creation of digital models that can be shared between institutions around the world, enabling comparative analyses that would have required enormously expensive and logistically complex specimen loans in earlier eras. Isotopic analysis of fossil tooth enamel can reveal diet and the isotopic signature of the environment in which an animal lived. Finite element analysis, a technique borrowed from engineering, allows researchers to model the stress patterns in a skull during biting, revealing how the bone was loaded and what forces it was designed to resist. Each of these techniques has been applied to Hell Creek specimens, and each has produced results that earlier approaches could not have yielded. The Hell Creek Formation is not simply a static resource being depleted by excavation. It is a resource whose value increases with each new analytical technique that is brought to bear on it. Specimens excavated and curated 100 years ago are still producing new discoveries as new methods are applied to them. There is something profound in that continuity, in the fact that a bone found by Barnum Brown in 1902 and curated at the American Museum of Natural History can be CT scanned in 2022 and reveal information about the animal that could not have been extracted when Brown first set eyes on it. The past is not finished. It keeps becoming more knowable. The geology of the Hell Creek Formation itself has been the subject of new work as well. The depositional environments of the formation, the river channels and floodplains and swamp margins that produced its extraordinary fossil record, have been mapped in 3 dimensions using drone surveys and satellite imagery that allow researchers to identify the most fossiliferous microenvironments from the air before any boots touch the ground. Geochemical analysis of the mudstone matrix has provided information about paleoclimate, about the patterns of seasonal flooding, and about the chemistry of the waters that buried and preserved the bones. The formation is not just a container for fossils, it is itself a document, and it is still being read. The Hell Creek Formation has, over the course of more than 100 years, produced enough material to keep paleontologists busy for another 100 years. The known specimens fill museum collections around the world. The unknown specimens are still coming out of the ground in quantities that decline slowly as the most productive sections are worked out, but that have never reached zero and show no sign of doing so. The badlands are still eroding. New surfaces are being exposed every spring. New specimens are appearing at the surface of the slopes, waiting for the right person with the right eye to walk by at the right time. There is a particular pleasure in that ongoingness, in the knowledge that the story is not finished, that somewhere in the Hell Creek Badlands right now, in a gully that has not been prospected this season, or in a slope that eroded over the winter into a new configuration, there is a bone emerging, maybe the corner of a jaw, maybe the end of a limb bone, Maybe something no one has ever seen before. Maybe the piece of evidence that will resolve one of the open questions that will finally settle the Nanotyrannus debate, or that will reveal what Tyrannosaurus looked like on its dorsal surface, or that will show a Hell Creek animal in a posture or context or association that will require the entire ecosystem model to be revised. It is out there, and someone will find it. The question of what survived the KPG extinction and why is as interesting as the question of what died, and the Hell Creek Formation has something to say about this too, because it is not only a graveyard of the lost, it is also a nursery of the surviving. The mammals of the Hell Creek world were, by modern standards, extraordinarily modest creatures. The largest Hell Creek mammal was probably Meniscoessus, a multi-tuber. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A multi-tuberculate roughly the size of a marmot, with rodent-like gnawing teeth and a body plan adapted for an omnivorous diet of seeds, insects, and small vertebrates. Most Hell Creek mammals were much smaller, ranging from mouse-sized to rat-sized, nocturnal by probability, living in burrows and in the dense undergrowth of the Cretaceous forest, utterly overshadowed by the giants that dominated the ecosystem. You would have needed a keen eye and a great deal of patience to spot them in the Hell Creek world. They were not significant players in the Cretaceous drama. They were bit characters. And yet they survived. They survived because of the accident of their smallness, which meant they needed less food. They survived because many of them were omnivores or insectivores, which meant they could subsist on resources that persisted when the plant-based food web collapsed. Seeds, insects, fungi, detritus. They survived perhaps because they sheltered underground, where temperatures were more stable and resources cached. The details of mammalian survival across the KPG boundary are still being actively studied, and the story is not as simple as it once appeared. Some mammal lineages did not survive. The multi-tuberculates, including a Meniscoessus, lingered for tens of millions of years after the extinction, but eventually went extinct. The mammalian groups that radiated explosively in the Paleogene, the placentals and marsupials that gave rise to every hoofed mammal and carnivore and primate alive today, were apparently quite rare and unspecialized in the Hell Creek world. But they were there. And after the extinction, with the ecological space vacated by the non-avian dinosaurs, they expanded into niches that had been occupied for 165 million years by animals that were suddenly gone. The Hell Creek Formation grades upward into the Fort Union Formation, the Paleogene rock deposited in the same region in the millions of years after the extinction. The mammal fossils in the Fort Union are dramatically more diverse, more abundant, and larger than those in the Hell Creek. The story of the mammalian radiation, the explosive evolutionary diversification that produced the modern world of large mammals, is written in the rock just above the KPG boundary in the Badlands of Montana and North Dakota. The birds of the Hell Creek Formation are also part of this survival story, though they are frustratingly difficult to study. Bird bones are light and fragile, and they do not fossilize as readily as the robust bones of large dinosaurs. The Hell Creek avifauna is known mostly from fragmentary material, isolated teeth and small bones that give hints of diversity without providing the complete picture we have for the large non-avian dinosaurs. What is clear is that multiple lineages of birds were present in the Hell Creek world, some of which crossed the KPG boundary and some of which did not. The toothed birds, including the Hesperornithines and Ichthyornithines that had been prominent in the Cretaceous, went extinct with the non-avian dinosaurs. The lineages that survived were the ancestors of the modern orders, the birds of today. Daniel Ksepka of the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, and his colleagues have done extensive work on the evolutionary tree of modern birds and the timing of their diversification. And the picture that emerges from this work is nuanced. Many of the major modern bird lineages appear to have diverged very close to or just after the KPG boundary, suggesting that the extinction event was a catalyst for rapid avian evolution, opening ecological space that bird lineages diversified to fill. But some lineages appear to have been present before the extinction, meaning that the ancestral birds of some modern groups were living in the Hell Creek world alongside Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, quietly going about their small lives in the undergrowth, surviving not through any advantage in intelligence or ability, but through the accident of size and diet that allowed them to persist when everything enormous died. There is something almost unbearable about this contingency if you let it settle in properly. The survival of birds, and through birds the survival of the entire avian dinosaur lineage, was not inevitable. It was not the result of fitness in any grand evolutionary sense. It was luck. The asteroid did not select the survivors by their qualities. It selected them by their smallness and their diet and their shelter, and the line between those that survived and those that did not, drawn by a random impactor from space, has echoed across 66 million years to produce every living thing on Earth today, including you. The Hell Creek Formation has been studied for over 100 years, and there is no sign that it has finished producing discoveries that matter. In recent years, some of the most exciting work has come not from large skeletons, but from small and fragmentary material, and from the application of techniques that did not exist when the great early collectors were working. Mary Schweitzer of North Carolina State University made one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of paleontology when she examined the interior structure of a Tyrannosaurus rex femur, specimen MOR 1125 from the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, under a scanning electron microscope in 2005. What she found inside that 68-million-year-old bone shocked the scientific community. There were flexible, transparent structures that appeared to be remnants of original biological tissue, what appeared to be blood vessels, and red-brown material that appeared to be remnants of red blood cells. The paper she published in Science in 2005 was greeted with intense skepticism. Organic molecules, the conventional wisdom held, could not possibly survive for 68 million years. Schweitzer persisted, and subsequent work has substantially confirmed her findings. Chemical analyses have identified proteins, including collagen, in the Tyrannosaurus material, and similar findings have been reported from other dinosaur specimens. The proteins are heavily degraded, cross-linked, and chemically modified in ways that are consistent with extreme antiquity, but they are there. What this means for our understanding of preservation is profound and still being worked out. It suggests that under the right conditions, specific mineral environments that protect biological molecules from degradation, organic material can survive far longer than the standard models of taphonomy predicted. It also raises the tantalizing but not yet realized possibility that ancient protein sequences might one day tell us more about dinosaur biology than bones alone can. Collagen sequences contain phylogenetic information. If enough intact sequence can be recovered from dinosaur specimens, it might eventually be possible to resolve questions about evolutionary relationships that bone anatomy alone cannot answer. The field of paleoproteomics, the study of ancient proteins, is in its infancy, and the Hell Creek Formation is one of its primary sources of material. The question of dinosaur coloration is another frontier where new techniques are producing surprising results. Melanosomes, these cellular organelles that produce pigment in modern birds and other animals, are preserved in some fossil feathers from exceptional preservation sites. Analysis of melanosome shape can, in some cases, indicate what color a feather was in life, because different melanosome shapes produce different pigments. Iridescent feathers have differently shaped melanosomes from matte black feathers, which have differently shaped melanosomes from reddish-brown feathers. This analysis has been applied to several feathered dinosaurs from the Chinese Yixian Formation, producing the first direct evidence of dinosaur coloration, including iridescent black in the small Paravian dinosaur Microraptor, and reddish-brown in the closely related Anchiornis. These techniques have not yet been applied to Hell Creek material in ways that have produced results of similar clarity, largely because the Hell Creek preservation environment is not as exceptional as the Yixian. But the techniques exist, and as sample sizes grow and methods improve, the possibility of understanding the coloration of Hell Creek dinosaurs in more direct ways becomes increasingly real. The animals in the ground are not finished yielding secrets. The ecosystem of the Hell Creek Formation, as it is now understood, was a complex, sophisticated, and in many ways deeply familiar world. It was a world of social animals communicating through color and sound and behavior. It was a world of parental care and group dynamics and ecological interdependence. The rivers and floodplains of Late Cretaceous Montana supported a food web of extraordinary richness. Large predators at the top, large herbivores in the middle, small omnivores and insectivores filling every niche beneath, birds in the canopy and on the water, mammals in the undergrowth, reptiles in the rivers, insects in the air. It was, in most of the ways that matter ecologically, a functional analogue to a modern African savanna, with the roles filled by unfamiliar bodies, but the relationships between those bodies recognizable and real. And then it ended. In the space of an afternoon, in geological terms, the ecosystem that had taken millions of years to assemble was destroyed. The rivers still ran. The rock was still there. The plant seeds in the soil were still viable. But the great animals that had structured the ecosystem, the predators and the prey, the herds of hadrosaurs, and the individuals of Tyrannosaurus, were gone. The world that emerged from the wreckage was smaller, quieter, and fundamentally different. It took millions of years, and even then, it was not the same world rebuilt. It was a new world, built by different animals from the rubble of the old. That new world is the one you live in. The mammals that huddled in burrows through the impact winter eventually gave rise to the first true placentals, and from those small, generalized ancestors sprang the extraordinary diversity of modern mammals. The whales, the bats, the elephants, the horses, the rodents, the primates. Your lineage was in the Hell Creek world. The animal that would become your ancestor 66 million times removed was alive and breathing in the undergrowth of that late Cretaceous forest, small and furtive and unaware that in a fraction of a second, everything was about to change. This is the thing about the Hell Creek Formation that I cannot stop coming back to. The thing that makes it different from any other fossil site in the world. It is not just a record of what lived. It is a record of the moment before everything changed. It preserves the last chapter of the Mesozoic with a clarity and completeness that no other geological unit can match. And at its very top, at the KPG boundary, it preserves the chapter Break itself, visible in centimeters of clay. Below that clay, one world, complete and functioning and complex. Above it, nothing. And then, slowly, the new world beginning. The hell of Hell Creek, if there is one, is not the creek's difficult terrain or the summer heat of the Badlands. It is the knowledge that all of this, the elaborate social lives, the display structures, the growth trajectories, the ecological relationships that took hundreds of millions of years to build, ended at a single moment. And the mercy of it, if there is mercy in geology, is that the ending was too fast for suffering, not for the animals on the day, not for the fish dying in the Tanis Seiche, but for the world as a whole. There was no slow decline, no centuries of struggle. There was the world, and then there was not the world. And in that gap, which is barely visible in the rock if you know where to look, the future began. The Badlands of eastern Montana are quiet in a way that few places in the world are quiet. The wind moves through them constantly, but it is not a human noise. The sky above them is enormous. The colors of the eroding mudstone, the pale grays and the ochres and the rusts shift through the day as the light changes, And in the evening, when the sun is low, the shadows pool in the gullies and the ridgelines glow. It is a beautiful place, genuinely beautiful, in the way that places stripped of distraction tend to be. And if you are there in the right season, after a wet spring that has softened the surface of the slopes, you might find something. A dark shape in the crumbling face of a hillside. A curve slightly too regular for the rock around it. A surface that catches the light differently from the matrix. A bone coming up, still becoming itself again after 66 million years of being stone. There are people who spend their lives finding those moments, and they are not motivated by fame or money. Though some have gotten both, they are motivated by something simpler. The desire to know. The desire to hold in their hands the evidence of a world that existed before memory, before language, before anything we think of as human history, and to understand it. To build from fragments a picture of something real, something that breathed and moved and reproduced and competed and died, something whose existence shaped the course of life on Earth in ways that still reverberate in every bird that calls outside your window, in every mammal that moves through the grass, in the body you are lying in right now. You carry the KPG boundary inside you, not literally, not in your cells, but in the shape of your evolutionary history. The fact that you are here, mammalian and warm-blooded and complex and awake tonight, listening to a story about a graveyard in Montana, is a direct consequence of the asteroid that struck the Yucatan 66 million years ago. If the impactor had missed, if its trajectory had been slightly different, if it had struck the Pacific rather than the Yucatan carbonate platform and produced a less catastrophic ejector cloud, the Cretaceous might have continued. The mammals might have remained small and peripheral for another 100 million years. The non-avian dinosaurs might still be here, still ruling the large animal niches, still evolving and diversifying. There might have been no age of mammals, no primates, no hominins, no you. The extinction that ended the Hell Creek world was not the end of everything. It was the end of a particular version of everything, and the beginning of another. The rock records both. The last days of one world in its lowest layers, and the slow, tentative beginning of the next in the layers above. Both are real, both matter, and the boundary between them, that thin smear of iridium-rich clay found on every continent and at the bottom of every ocean, is the hinge on which the door of modern life swings. Tonight, as you let the story settle and the edges of your thinking soften towards sleep, carry this with you lightly. The world you live in was made by loss. The complexity and richness of modern life, every mammal that walks and every bird that flies, emerged from the wreckage of a world that was, by any measure, magnificent. The dinosaurs of the Hell Creek Formation were not primitive. They were not inferior. They were extraordinary animals living extraordinary lives in an extraordinary world, and they were destroyed not because they failed, but because the universe is indifferent to success. What survived was what happened to survive, and from that accident of survival, over 66 million years of slow, patient, unceasing evolution, the entire living world you know was assembled. The hawk on the wire outside your window is a theropod dinosaur. The flowers in the garden are the flowering plants that evolved in the Cretaceous and survived the impact. The soil is made partly from the compressed and transformed remains of the Cretaceous world. And you, here, warm and horizontal, breathing slowly, are the latest expression of a line that was small and frightened in the undergrowth of the Hell Creek world, that survived by luck and stayed alive by feeding on seeds and insects in the cold dark after the sky went dark. Rest now in the knowledge of how long the road was, how many catastrophes were survived, how many narrow passages the line of your ancestors threaded through, not through strength or wisdom, but through chance, through smallness, through being in the right place when the wrong thing happened to everything else. You are the improbable end of a very long story. You are what the Hell Creek Formation eventually produced, after everything it contained had been stripped away, and the world had to begin again from the small and the hidden and the persistent. Sleep comes at the end of a long day, and the long day of life on Earth has been longer than anything your mind can comfortably hold, punctuated by catastrophes that seem impossible to survive, and yet survived, again and again, by something too small to see coming. The bones are still coming out of the ground in Montana. The story is still being told, and the telling of it, this slow, patient recounting of a world that ended and a world that began, is its own kind of continuity, a thread of attention reaching back across the dark through 66 million years of changed and changing Earth to touch, very lightly, what was once alive there and is now stone and is now slowly, in the telling, alive again. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.